Jihadism is a 21st-century neologism found in the Western languages to describe for militant Islamic movements perceived as a military movement, rooted in Islam, and existentially threatening to the West. The term jihadism was coined in the 2000s and mostly used to cover Islamic insurgency and Islamic terrorism since that time. But it has also been extended to cover both mujahideen guerrilla warfare and Islamic terrorism with an international scope since it arose in the 1980s. Since the 1990s, substantially represented by the Al-Qaeda network. Contemporary jihadism ultimately has its roots in the late 19th and early 20th century ideological developments of Islamic revivalism, developed into Qutbism and related ideologies during the mid-20th century. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 reinforced the rise of jihadism, which has been propagated in various armed conflicts throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Gilles Kepel has diagnosed a specifically Salafi jihadism within the Salafi movement of the 1990s. Jihadism with an international, pan-Islamist scope in this sense is also known as global jihadism. Generally, the term jihadism denotes Sunni Islamist armed struggle. Sectarian tensions led to numerous forms of jihadism in opposition to Shia Islam, to Sufism and to Ahmadiyya terminology. The term jihadism has been in use since about 2000, first in the Indian and Pakistani media, and by French academics who used the more exact term jihadist Salafist. According to Martin Kramer as of 2003, jihadism is used to refer to the most violent persons and movements in contemporary Islam, including Al-Qaeda. Gilles Kepel is associated with early usage of the term, and the term has seen wider use in French media since about 2004. Use of jihadism has been criticized as clumsy and controversial, on the grounds that in much of the Islamic world the term jihad simply refers to the internal spiritual campaign that one wages with oneself. The term jihadist globalism is also often used in relation to jihadism. Steger proposes an extension of the term jihadist globalism to apply to all extremely violent strains of religiously influenced ideologies that articulate the global imaginary into concrete political agendas and terrorist strategies. Jihad cool is a term used by Western security experts concerning the rebranding of militant jihadism into something fashionable, or cool, to younger people through social media, magazines, rap videos, clothing, toys, propaganda videos, and other means. It is a subculture mainly applied to individuals in developed nations who are recruited to travel to conflict zones on jihad. For example, jihadi rap videos make participants look more MTV than mosque, according to NPR, which was the first to report on the phenomenon in 2010. Jihad fi sabilillah. According to Bernard Lewis, the term jihad is often followed by the words, "in the path of God," a phrase found in the Quran. The phrase is reused in modern jihadism. Thus, fi sabilillah armbands were worn by rebels in Xinjiang when battling Soviet forces, and the phrase has been spotted on flags used by jihadists in Caucasia in the 2000s. Offensive jihad. Offensive jihad is jihad to expand Dar al-Islam, transforming Dar al-Harb into Dar al-Islam and establish Islamic social order, Sharia law. An example of this kind of jihad is described in the famous fatwa, Defense of the Muslim Lands, the first obligation after Iman, calling for jihad in Afghanistan, written by Islamist cleric Abdullah Yusuf Azam. Azam describes offensive jihad as fard kifaya, rather than fard ain, and thus a lower priority than defensive jihad, where the kuffar, non-Muslims, are not gathering to fight the Muslims. The fighting becomes fard kifaya with the minimum requirement of appointing believers to guard borders, and the sending of an army at least once a year to terrorize the enemies of Allah. It is a duty of the Imam, leader of the Muslim community, to assemble and send out an army unit into the land of war once or twice every year. Moreover, it is the responsibility of the Muslim population to assist him, and if he does not send an army he is in sin. And the ulama have mentioned that this type of jihad is for maintaining the payment of jizya, tax on non-Muslims. According to another source, offensive jihad was the type of jihad practiced by the early Muslim community, because their weakness meant no defensive action would have sufficed to protect them against the allied tribal forces determined to exterminate them. Jihad is a collective duty, and offensive jihad is synonymous in classical Islamic law and tradition, which also asserted that offensive jihad could only be declared by the caliph. But an individually incumbent jihad required only awareness of an oppression targeting Islam or Islamic peoples. History. Extremism within Islam goes back to the 7th century to the Kharijites. From their essentially political position, they developed extreme doctrines that set them apart from both mainstream Sunni and Shia Muslims. The Kharijites were particularly noted for adopting a radical approach to takfir, whereby they declared other Muslims to be unbelievers and therefore deemed them worthy of death. Later extremist movements that used terror and killed Muslim leaders included Qarmatians and Assassins. Precursor movements when jihadism is specifically motivated by pan-Islamism, i.e., the ultimate aim of spreading Islam worldwide under a restored caliphate. It is often called global jihadism. But jihadism can also be motivated regionally, in an attempt to establish an Islamic state in a specific homeland. Global jihadism is usually involved with international Islamic terrorism, while regional jihadism takes the form of guerrilla warfare, possibly also paired with terrorist attacks. While the Western term of jihadism was coined only in the early 2000s, and in retrospect applied to developments since the end of the Cold War era, this type of Islamist armed uprising against a secular government goes back to the early 19th century. The transition of this form of guerrilla warfare was the decline of the great Muslim empires of the early modern period, which could wage war on the scale of a great power and did not need to rely on asymmetric warfare. Dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. Early jihadist conflicts include fuller jihads took place between the late 18th century and the fall of the Sokoto Caliphate in 1903, Fulani War, Padri War, Java War, Caucasus War, Algerian Resistance Movement, Mahdist War, Somali Dervishes, Moro Rebellion, ACEH War, Basmachi Movement, Libyan Resistance Movement. Modern Islamism developed in the 1920s, and there have been a number of armed jihads informed by this movement since then. Kumul Rebellion, Islamic Rebellion in Xinjiang, Insurgency in the Philippines, Arakan Rebellion. While the jihads waged in the 19th and early to mid-20th century occasionally did involve Western colonial powers, the phenomenon did remain mostly limited to the Middle East and the wider Muslim world. This changed significantly with the foundation of the State of Israel and the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict after the end of World War II. This sparked the beginning of international Islamic terrorism and put jihadism on the global agenda. Islamic revivalism and Salafism. According to scholar of Islam and Islamic history Rudolf Peters, contemporary traditionalist Muslims copy phrases of the classical works on fiqh in their writings on jihad. Islamic modernists emphasize the defensive aspect of jihad, regarding it as tantamount to bellum justum in modern international law, and the contemporary fundamentalists view it as a struggle for the expansion of Islam and the realization of Islamic ideals. Jihad has been propagated in modern fundamentalism beginning in the late 19th century, an ideology that arose in context of struggles against colonial powers in North Africa in the late 19th century, as in the Mahdist War in Sudan, and notably in the mid-20th century by Islamic revivalist authors such as Sayyid Qutb and Abul Alam Awjadi. The term jihadism has arisen in the 2000s to refer to the contemporary jihadi movements, the development of which was in retrospect traced to developments of Salafism paired with the origins of al-Qaeda in the Soviet war in Afghanistan. During the 1990s, jihadism has been called an offshoot of Islamic revivalism of the 1960s and 1970s. The writings of Sayyid Qutb and Muhammad Abdul Salam Faraj provide inspiration. The Soviet war in Afghanistan is said to have amplified the jihadist tendency from a fringe phenomenon to a major force in the Muslim world. It served to produce foot soldiers, leadership and organization. Abdullah Yusuf Azam provided propaganda for the Afghan cause. After the war, veteran jihadists returned to their home countries and dispersed to other sites of conflicts involving Muslim populations such as Algeria, Bosnia and Chechnya, creating a transnational jihadist stream. Kashmir conflict, Somali civil war, Algerian civil war, Bosnian war, Afghan civil war, East Turkestan irredentism, Chechen war and insurgency in the North Caucasus, Nigerian Sharia conflict, Iraqi insurgency, al-Qaeda insurgency in Yemen, Syrian civil war. An explanation for jihadist willingness to kill civilians and self-professed Muslims on the grounds that they were actually apostates is the vastly reduced influence of the traditional diverse class of ulama, often highly educated Islamic jurists. In the vast majority of Muslim countries during the post-colonial world of the 1950s and 60s, the private religious endowments that had supported the independence of the Islamic scholars, jurists for centuries were taken over by the state. The jurists were made salaried employees, and the nationalist rulers naturally encouraged their employees to serve the rulers' interests. Inevitably, the jurists came to be seen by the Muslim public as doing so. Into this vacuum of religious authority came aggressive proselytizing funded by $10s of billions of petroleum export money. The version of Islam being propagated billed itself as a return to pristine, simple, straightforward Islam, not one school among many, and not interpreting divine law historically or contextually, but the one, orthodox, straight path, of Islam. Unlike the traditional teachings of the jurists who tolerated and even celebrated divergent opinions and schools of thought and kept extremism marginalized, Wahhabism had extreme hostility to any sectarian divisions within Islam. Interreligious against Sikhs, a rebel camp was set up in the early 19th century by Sayyid Ahmed Belvi after leaving India for Afghanistan. There he set up a rebel camp to launch attacks against the Sikh power which was centered in the Punjab before focusing his attention of the British. Waliullah's teachings directly inspired jihad against Sikhs between 1826 and 1831. Against Hindus, the Hindu Kush refers to a region in northwest India and translates as the slaughter of the Hindus. It refers to an incident when Hindus were transported to Muslim courts. Aurangzeb supervised a book called Fatwa al-Hindiya which dealt with the subject of jihad. Jihad was also considered by OSIMI in response to the 2002 Gujarat riots against Buddhists in 1532. Sultan Said Khan launched a jihad against Tibetan Buddhists. He thought that Lhasa was a direction of prayer for all the Chinese and therefore sought to destroy its main temple. The jihadist expedition was led by Mirza Muhammad Hyder Duglat. Against Jews, there are references in some hadiths to jihad being launched against Jews. Ayman al-Zawahiri declared a fatwa of jihad against Jews in 1998. One of the earliest jihads against Jews occurred in 627 AD against the Jewish Banu Qurayza tribe. Against Zoroastrians during the Muslim conquest of Persia, jihadists caused the fall of the largely Zoroastrian Sasanian Empire. Major battles included the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah and Battle of Nahawand. Against pagans during Muhammad's lifetime, there were many battles fought between Muslims and pagans. Examples of these include the Battle of Badr and Battle of the Trench. After conquest of Mecca in Hijri 8, however, Muhammad forgave all the pagan enemies, which resulted in most of them converting to Islam. Against atheists during the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, many Muslims received calls for a jihad against atheists. Mujahideen were recruited from various countries including Egypt, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. The conflict gradually turned from one against occupation to one seen as a jihad. Against Christians, the European Crusaders reconquered much of the territory seized by the Islamic State, dividing it into 4 kingdoms, the most important being the State of Jerusalem. The Crusades originally had the goal of recapturing Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule and were originally launched in response to a call from the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire for help against the expansion of the Muslim Seljuk Turks into Anatolia. There was little drive to retake the lands from the Crusaders, save the few attacks made by the Egyptian Fatimids. This changed, however, with the coming of Zangi, ruler of what is today northern Iraq. He took Edessa, which triggered the Second Crusade, which was little more than a 47-year stalemate. The stalemate was ended with the victory of Salah al-Din al-Aibar, known in the West as Saladin, over the forces of Jerusalem at the Horns of Hattin in 1187. It was during the course of the stalemate that a great deal of literature regarding jihad was written. 6. While amassing his armies in Syria, Saladin had to create a doctrine which would unite his forces and make them fight until the bitter end, which would be the only way they could reconquer the lands taken in the First Crusade. He did this through the creation of jihad propaganda. It stated that anyone who would abandon the jihad would be committing a sin that could not be washed away by any means. It also put his emirs at the center of power, just under his rule. While this propaganda was successful in uniting his forces for a time, the fervor burned out quickly. Much of Saladin's teachings were rejected after his death. Intra-religious. Against Shia, the Syrian civil war became a focus for Sunni fighters waging jihad on Shia. The Al-Nusra Front is the largest jihadist group in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has called for jihad against the Syrian government and against that government's Shiite allies. Saudi Arabia backs the jihad against the Shia in Syria using proxies. Sunni jihadi converge in Syria from Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Yemen, Kuwait, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, Bosnia, other Arab states, Chechnya, Pakistan, Afghanistan and Western countries. Literature. Abbas, Tahir. Islamic Political Radicalism. A European Perspective. Edinburgh University Press. ISBN 978-0-7486-2528-4. Akbarzadeh, Shiram. Islam and Political Violence. Muslim Diaspora and Radicalism in the West. IB Taurus & Co. Limited. ISBN 978-1-84511-473-2. Al-Rashid, Madawi. Dying for Faith. Religiously Motivated Violence in the Contemporary World. IB Taurus & Co. Limited. ISBN 978-1-84511-687-3. Aslan, Reza. Global Jihadism. ISBN 978-3-639-25006-0. Giles Keppel, Jihad. The Trail of Political Islam. Brackman, Jarrett. Global Jihadism. Theory and Practice. Volume 10 of Cass Series on Political Violence. Taylor and Francis. ISBN 978-0-415-45241-0. *. The Devolution of Jihadism. From Al-Qaeda to Wider Movement. Stratfor. 2010. ISBN 978-1-4537-4664-6. Gulsait, Rick. Jihadi Terrorism and the Radicalization Challenge in Europe. Ashgate. ISBN 978-0-7546-7217-3. Heckhammer, Thomas. Jihad in Saudi Arabia. Violence and Pan-Islamism since 1979. Cambridge University Press. ISBN 978-0-521-51858-1. Khosrokova, Fahad. Inside Jihadism. Understanding Jihadi Movements Worldwide. Paradigm. ISBN 978-1-59451-616-0. Lahore, Nellie. The Jihadist Path to Self-Destruction. C. Hurst & Co. Publishers Limited. ISBN 978-1-84904-062-4. Lolka, Rudiger. Jihadism. Online Discourses and Representations. Vienna University Press. ISBN 978-3-8471-0068-3. Lolka, Rudiger. New Approaches to the Analysis of Jihadism. Vienna University Press. ISBN 978-3-89971-900-0. Malik, K. The Quranic Concept of War. Himalayan Books. ISBN 81-7002-020-4. Pargeter, Alison. The New Frontiers of Jihad. Radical Islam in Europe. IB Taurus & Co. Limited. ISBN 978-1-84511-391-9. Ransdorp, Magnus. Understanding Violent Radicalization. Rutledge. ISBN 978-0-415-55630-9. Rhodes, Darian. Salafist Takfiri Jihadism. The Ideology of the Caucasus Emirate. International Institute for Counterterrorism. Sageman, Mark. Leaderless Jihad. Terror Networks in the 21st Century. University of Pennsylvania Press. ISBN 978-0-8122-4065-8. Sanchez, James. Who's Who in Al-Qaeda and Jihadi Movements in South and Southeast Asia. 19,906 Key Individuals, Organizations, Incidents, and Linkages. Lulu. ISBN 978-1-4303-1473-8. Vertigans, Stephen. Militant Islam. A Sociology of Characteristics, Causes and Consequences. Rutledge. ISBN 978-0-415-41246-9. De Pomeroy, Isabel. To Fight Homegrown Jihadish, Germany Takes Lesson from Battle with Neo-Nazis. The Christian Science Monitor.